So just like everyone else, today I'm going to talk about FHIR, more specifically Smart on FHIR. And at the start, I'm not going to bore you with an introduction just yet. So right now, judge me by what I say and not by who I am. Seeing as I'm the first one at this webinar, it makes sense for me to do kind of an introduction to Smart on FHIR, although Josh gave an important one already. Basically, it's a framework to integrate health apps, or more specifically, those applications that have FHIR underneath. And basically, it specifies stuff such as the single sign-on, how to obtain the FHIR resources, how access control is enforced, scopes, etc. And one way of using this framework is context launching. Basically, what context launching is opening an app within an app and taking the context with you. Let's say that here on the screen is something that presents, it's an illustration of an EMR. So you have a logged in clinician and you have some data that the clinician fills in inside the EMR. And the idea is that the clinician can continue using the EMR that they're fond of. They know exactly where the data comes from. They know exactly what to put in. And once they do that, once they do stuff within the EMR, they press on a button called launch. And what that does is that opens another application, so your application. And it launches it in an iframe, but more importantly, it takes the whole context with you. So the whole context that you filled in inside an EMR is automatically passed down, meaning that the SSO happened, the user is logged in, and everything that the clinician filled in inside the EMR is automatically populated at the second app. And then we proudly call this integration. Even though some may say, mostly the tech people on the call may say that this is an outdated and dull kind of integration because it's an iframe kind of integration. But in the kind of the rigid ecosystem that is the health IT, this is kind of a big thing, be that as it may. But basically it presents two key benefits. One key benefit is that we know that clinicians don't want to switch between different contexts. They don't want to log out and log in to a new application, and they want to continue using applications that they're fond of and they know how to use. They can continue using the application and don't need to switch between them. And another key benefit is that this presents kind of a compromise between the vendor lock-in phenomena that we know that these big EMR vendors had just a couple of years ago when the whole data was locked in a proprietary model. So it's a compromise between that and kind of a fully open platform. And Smart on FHIR on top of the context launching that provides kind of a framework that tells you how the context launching should happen. It's a perfect thing to have with that. So basically what Smart on FHIR does, it describes how context should be passed, how security and access control is enforced, and basically in what way are the IDP and the EMR's clinical data repository kind of tightly coupled. So what was our use case? We have a solution called collaborative decision making, which is basically an online solution for multidisciplinary tumor boards. It streamlines the process around that. It makes sure all the data is properly gathered and reviewed, and it makes sure that the relevant clinical data at the end is also pushed to the correct patient repositories. All of that is happening. The project is in the Netherlands. Basically, we have built a regional collaboration platform that right now consists of 6 hospitals. But more importantly for this webinar, there are 3 different EMRs that we have integrated into. But more importantly, we have a clear vision and goal to scale this further. So we definitely didn't want to make a solution with which we would limit only to those 3 EMR vendors. And like, for example, with the same solution, albeit for a different purpose, we have also integrated with Cerner, for example. So basically what our solution is, it follows a variety of steps. And the first step is that the clinician needs to gather all relevant clinical documentation for the tumor board. And this is already where the Smart on FHIR comes in handy, because the clinician can do that, as I said, using the EMR that they're fond of. They know where each data comes from. They know how to prepare the patient demographics information. They know where and how to fetch the documents that are relevant for the tumor board. So they do that all within the EMR. And so the first step kind of presents an ease into our application. So once the user does that, once they prepare everything relevant for the tumor board, the so-called request data, they press on a button called Launch Vitally, Vitally being the name of our platform. Now this is when the magic happens. So our application is invoked in an iframe, so a general HTTP GET, with an additional launch parameter. This is per smartphone FHIR spec. And that launch parameter contains some gibberish that the IDP and the EMR knows how to resolve to actually return you the context that the clinician prepared at first. So when our application is invoked, we do an identity brokering to the EMR's IDP, and because the clinician was logged into that IDP, the single sign-on automatically happens because the session already exists. So what happens? The IDP logs you in, issues you a token, but additionally, it's the IDP that gives you the context that the clinician had within the EMR. And the context is presented in terms of FHIR resource IDs. So right now, what do we have? We have a user that's completely logged in based on the SSO, so no additional login was required. And we have a set of FHIR resource IDs that present the EMR context. So the next logical thing, of course, is for us to resolve those FHIR resources so that we actually get the data that the user filled in, and we do that the standard FHIR way. And the next step is us having a fully logged in user as well as the whole set of FHIR resources that present the context. So this was standard. This was plug and play smart on FHIR. And you could, up until here, really code your software following this and expect it to work for everyone, for every vendor that supports smart on FHIR. But after getting the context, after getting the data that presents the context, it's really like a wild west. And the reason is because that context can be presented in a variety of different resources per vendor. So vendors have every right to model their data, for example, with an encounter, whilst the other EMR can map it to an appointment, the third one to an observation, and there's really nothing you can do about it. Because unless there's a FHIR implementation guideline or a FHIR profile that tells you exactly that for this use case that you're covering, EMRs need to use these FHIR resources, they can do whatever they please. And our example was that they really did whatever they pleased. So one EMR presented us with one set of resources for the context, another one with another set of resources for the context, etc. And that brings us to a solution that we have created. And we have created kind of a solution that's flexible and adaptable to all that. So whatever set of FHIR resources we get, we are able to somehow make sense of that data. And how we do that is to set it on a common denominator. So our solution to be effectively context launch, requires 3 data blocks, so to say. We require the patient information, we require the general tumor board data, and we require the request form, which is question answer fields. And as I said, we didn't want to limit ourselves only to those 3 EMRs, so we had to make up with a solution that would cater to a variety of different EMRs. So to illustrate a problem that we have faced, for example, the first EMR presented the context with the patient ID and the encounter ID. And those 3 blocks that you see here present the data blocks that we required to resolve and are presented in an integration steps. So the first integration step was the resolving of the patient demographics. And we did that with the general read on the patient resource with the patient ID. And whatever we got back sufficed for the patient data block. The second integration step was obtaining the general tumor board data. And the vendor behind the EMR, or rather the hospital that was using the EMR, told us that the general tumor board data would be presented in the encounter resource. So we did the read of the encounter. And whatever we got back, we parsed and we fetched that data, or rather with FHIR-PET, extracted the data that was relevant to us. And then in the third integration step, there was the request form, so the question and answers that we needed to get. And for that, they told us that we need to do a search on observations, and that we need to do it with a fixed query parameter, smart data being the category, and also the patient and the encounter ID. What was the result was a couple of observations that presented those request forms, so all 3 data blocks were successfully obtained. Then the second EMR was already a bit more complex. We were presented with the task ID. And they told us that if we want to get the patient demographics, we first need to do a read on the task, and then we need to extract the patient reference from the task to do a read of the patient. So these were kind of 2 integration steps that we needed to do to fetch the patient data block that we required. And the general tumor board data and the request form were all kind of combined in one integration step. We had to do a search and observations with the specified code, and based on the out token, they also knew which context this is about. What was the result was a couple of observations, and we had to differentiate between them because one of those specified the general tumor board data and the other set of those specified the request form. Now the third one, that was a jungle. Like, it had an encounter with the link to observation, with the link to an appointment, with the link to the patient. But to get all that, you first needed to do a post on a condition. I'm just kidding, like, this didn't really happen. But the point is that it could, right? And it would all be per spec. It would be legit FHIR modeling. Legit, arguably, but still it would be FHIR modeling that if an EMR decided to do it that way, they could model it that way. And they could present the context in that way. Because one EMR can think of one way, and the other EMR can think of a different way of how to model the context that we require. And so you really need to, when you're covering that part, you really need to strive to develop your solution in an agnostic and pragmatic kind of way, so you don't limit yourself to just one vendor and one set of FHIR resources that could present you with the context. So what we did do, in short, we did a configurable and flexible way of how to configure those integration blocks. So both how to obtain the right data with a variety of integration steps, as well as how to make sense of that data. And this was all done with the proprietary JSON configuration that strongly depended on FHIR path. But the idea is that nothing is fixed, nothing is hard-coded, and nothing is vendor or project specific. And this example can be seen here, where on the right-hand side you can see the JSON configuration for resolving of the first data blocks of the patient. Basically, what we tell our code with this is that the patient is going to be resolved in 2 integration steps, which are represented with the steps being an array here. The first integration step, we're going to do a read on the encounter, and we're going to do a read based on the original context ID. So this is the constant that was given to us as part of the Smart on FHIR launch. The response cardinality expected is 1, which is logical because it was a read, so the first or the only one response was taken. And once that integration step was complete, the second integration step was to parse, or rather to extract the relevant patient reference within the encounter. So we fetch the participant where the type is patient, and we check for the individual of that and the reference, and then we did a read on that patient. So these are kind of 2 integration steps by how to obtain the patient. But this really all is flexible, and purely with JSON configuration, we found out an adaptable context launching mechanism. Like, the first test of this was already for this project, because we implemented all this in advance before we were even given access to those EMRs. And I'm proud to say that we were able to cover all those 3 EMRs, including the 4th one, so Cerner, with no additional development, purely with configuration of that JSON. But of course, the real test of this will be when we actually scale further in other regions and with other EMRs. So how much is plug and play? That was one of the questions. And as I said, when it comes to the Smart on FHIR, it really is. We have integrated with all 4 different EMRs, and we didn't need to change anything when it comes to the stuff that the Smart on FHIR covers. Like, sure, there are some differences, especially in terms of scope, or perhaps in terms of how strict the IDP is in terms of validating, for example, the audience parameter, etc. But all that is minor. Generally speaking, I think that if you have developed a Smart on FHIR compliant capability for your product, good chances are that you won't need to adapt it for any such compliant vendor, EMR vendor. But as I said, then comes the content part. So the part that comes after Smart on FHIR. And with that, basically anything goes. Now, if we circle back to the beginning, all this is a project called DDMN. As I said, it's a regional MDO collaboration platform involving 6 hospitals and 3 different EMRs. And the fact is that we ended up with just 1 installation covering all that, and just having 6 different configurations, because even different hospitals can use the same EMR but different modeling of the context. And it works, and we're pretty confident that we will be able to support different EMRs in different regions purely with configuration. And now the least important thing, the thing that I didn't do at the beginning, I am Gasper Andrejc. I'm health IT domain lead at Parsek, which is an open line company with offices in Slovenia, UK, and Netherlands. We have a variety of use case-driven solutions for care pathways, for multidisciplinary tumor boards, for patient portals. But the thing is that all of those have a strong interoperable core underneath, which is also the core that made this whole integration possible. Otherwise, I have been working in the health ID for roughly 8 years, lately more and more with structured standards such as FHIR and OpenAir. But of course, I'm daily involved with H27 and IHE standards and profiles as well. Anyhow, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope I'm not too long, and I'm looking forward to discussing this more throughout the webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Gasper. You're just in time. So can you tell how much long it took to implement these integrations, like year, less?
I mean, we had some capabilities done up front because our platform is FHIR compliant from the very start. So the thing that we needed to code is to have this whole flexible way of resolving those resources. And that didn't take too long because you have the FHIR path for extracting the resources. Purely technical, you have reflection in Java that helps you with that as well, the Happy FHIR one. So I wouldn't say it took a year, but it did take like 2 quarters, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And for the Smart on FHIR part, we have an IDP which is Keycloak. We use Keycloak for that. And the Smart on FHIR part was out of the box worked with Keycloak. I think we needed to extend it a bit because we needed to forward the launch parameter with the identity brokering, but that was minor as well.
Mm-hmm. So you can classify it still like successful application of Smart on FHIR. So small automation, everything works, yeah?
Yeah.
Almost everything. Okay.
I have a question on just the Smart on FHIR part. You mentioned Keycloak as your IDP provider, right? So are you not launching, like when we integrate with EHRs or EMRs, however you want to call it, we create a launch endpoint for that specific EHR/EMR, and then once we launch with their launch endpoint, we get 2 query params, right? We get a launch query param, which is gibberish, but you have to pass it in the authorization endpoint because that's to match whatever is passed in, and then we also get the issuer URL, which is the FHIR server you're hitting, right? So, but we don't specify like, oh, we're using IDP provider Keycloak or Okta or Zero, wherever, because we're using whatever IDP provider they're using because we're creating a launch server URL for their FHIR server. We're using their FHIR server. For your implementation, how are you integrating EMRs and specifying what IDP provider you can use? That's where I'm kind of confused.
Yeah, so our solution uses its own identity provider, and this is Keycloak. And we use this for our own user management and everything with that. But a functionality of Keycloak enables you to do an identity brokering to an external IDP, meaning that once a user unauthenticated came to our solution, the user was automatically redirected to the IDP that we have configured as part of the identity brokering. And the launch and the gibberish and the audience, so the FHIR server URL was automatically passed to that IDP. Once the EMR's IDP issued an authorization token and what was the other one? So the authorization token and I think the JWT token, that was stored inside Keycloak. And when we needed to do the fetch to the FHIR server, we had to exchange the tokens. So we had to exchange the Keycloak token that it issued for us, our users, with the token that the Keycloak stores that came from EMR's IDP. If that makes sense.
That makes sense. Where I'm just lost is like, when we launch authorization endpoint for one of our EMRs, we get a login page that we can't like avoid, like skipping. No matter what, like we could have our own IDP provider on our end, right, to exchange tokens, verify, all that. But before we even get there, you still have to launch their IDP, process based on the authorization URL that is configured in a well-known configuration endpoint, right? That you hit that. Then if you specify response type equals code, you use the OIDC flow with or without Pixie, right? And then you hit the token endpoint with the authorization code. If you go that way, or the code type could be, it doesn't have to be authorization code. But the point is, like, I don't understand how you can skip that.
We don't really skip that, but so you're talking about why the SSO didn't happen for you.
Yeah,
The user, yeah. So the thing is that when users are using EMR, the EMR is connected to the same IDP that you're later going to when you do the Smart on FHIR launch. So the session already exists for the EMR because the EMR is connected to their IDP and the session is intact and exists. Then when they launch your solution, you redirect the user agent. So actually the EMR, you redirect the EMR because your application opened in an EMR, you redirect the EMR back to their IDP. So, and because the session exists already, their IDP automatically issues you a token without presenting you with another login.